very important to make us very clear about the role of assessment in school improvement, how this assessment plays a significant role, what kind of the assessment approaches that teachers are using in their classroom. So those approaches are very important to know about students' learning. So because assessment is all about gathering evidence of students' learning. So how can we get those evidences? What are the approaches the teachers are using in their classroom to gather all those kind of evidences about students' learning? So assessment to understand this particular concept of evidence of students' learning through assessment, there are many approaches. There are many approaches to assessment. So the teachers are using in their classrooms. And the schools and the educational institutions have their own understanding of using these assessment approaches to check the students' learning, to see how the students are getting things in the classrooms. So therefore, behind all these kind of assessment approaches which are in practice in schools, which are in practice in classrooms, so teachers have their own understanding. Because we are understanding school improvement in the light of different things, in the light of curriculum we talked about, in the light of teaching approaches that the teachers are using in the classroom, we have thoroughly discussed on all those approaches. Now we will look at what are the assessment approaches that the teachers are using in their classrooms. So when you will talk about this assessment, so definitely those teachers have some specific understanding, their own beliefs, their own theoretical and philosophical standpoints about this assessment. So those philosophies guide these teachers to use a particular approach in their classroom. So depending on those philosophies, those teachers are using some specific approaches. So in this lecture, the purpose of this lecture is to understand what are the philosophies which the teachers have about the assessment, and what kind of assessment approaches they are using in their classrooms, and how those approaches help teachers to gather the evidence of their students' learning about the topics they are teaching in the classroom. So here, let's look at the type of education and approaches to assessment and its impact on the school improvement. So from the very beginning, in this particular unit, we have been discussing three types of education. According to Jürgen Habermas, the first type is technical interest of education. And this technical interest of education is a very narrowly pursued view of education. It has a very limited philosophy about education. And this limited philosophy guides if a teacher believes in this particular philosophy, this particular type of education, the teacher will definitely focus on students' learning in the light of assessment as of learning. So we will discuss thoroughly what is assessment as of learning, जिसको हम summative assessment भी कहते हैं. Now that's how we can understand summative assessment. Similarly, when we will go to another type of education, that is an education that is practical interest of education. And to that we discussed this is a reformative philosophy. It's a modern philosophy of education. And a teacher having a modern philosophy, a reformative philosophy of education, may use his assessment approach as assessment for learning. So what is assessment as for learning, we will discuss later on. And similarly, the last type of education is emancipatory interest of education. And for an emancipatory interest of education, you know, it's a the purpose of education is to transforming learners. So that is the highest interest of education. So if a teacher has this level of education, so definitely that teacher will use an assessment as through learning. So what is assessment as through learning metaphorically? So we will explain later on. So all these kind of types of education, types of philosophies, and the approaches to assessment which the teachers are using in their classroom have a deeper understanding, have a deeper meaning for students' engagement in their learning. So students' engagements in their learning means how the students learn and what kind of the things students learn, at what level they are learning. Is their learning limited to only remembering and understanding level? Is their learning level reaches at applying and analyzing level? Is the level matches at evaluating and understanding level? This depends upon the practices which the teachers are engaged in their classroom. So certain approaches to assessment uh, have their own limitations for students' learning. As earlier we talked about, assessment is off learning. Assessment is off learning means you are looking at assessment as a summative form. At the end of a semester, at the end of a class, at the end of a session, at the end of a year, when a teacher asks some questions from student, and students have to give answers in black and white in writing in the form of an exam. So this is called assessment is off learning, because this particular assessment is very limited to reproducing something just that has already taught to student. So it has to do nothing with further, in the form of a feedback. There is no feedback in assessment as off learning. So this is just to check either the student has learned something which the teacher has given to him or her or not. So this is very limited thing. So in this particular assessment, the teaching ends, assessment starts. As earlier I talked to you, at the end of a class, at the end of a session, at the end of a semester, at the end of a year, teacher goes to look at what the student has learned. So therefore, this assessment is called assessment as off learning, and it's also known as it is an add-on activity. Add-on activity means the assessment that happens at the end of a class, at the end of a session, or at the end of a semester is something detached from teaching. Teaching has finished. Teaching is ended at some point of time. But here the only focus is on what has learned by students. That is to explore through particular questions, through particular sort of, some sort of engagement with students. So in this way, teacher can gather evidence, teacher can collect evidence of students' learning. So that's how you can make sense of this add-on activity. So this assessment is of learning is basically you are focusing on summative assessment. You may heard about summative assessment. This is how you can understand assessment as of learning is a metaphorical expression, is metaphorically understanding the meaning of assessment in the light of its limitation to particular understanding of gathering some evidence after completion of a course, after completion of a class, whether students have learned something or not. And interestingly, students, here I would like to share with you, interestingly, the purpose of this particular technical interest of education and conventional image of assessment is to use for promotion purpose, promotion to the next grade, promotion to the next class. Why we take exams after end of a semester, after end of an year, academic year? The purpose is to promote students to the next grade. That is the basic interest of this education. If your school teachers are using and focusing on only this sort of assessment, this means that they are focusing on a very limited view of education. That is just to impart education, impart some limited knowledge to students through their teaching, through their particular curriculum, and they want to check either the students have acquired that level of knowledge that the teacher has given to the students or not. And on the basis of that product and on the basis of that particular outcome of the students, they declare pass or fail. If they get the imparted knowledge reproduced there in their exam, so they will be able to promote to the next grade level. If the students could not show their evidence of uh, uh, learning in the form of in the form of that question answer paper, so they are declared as fail. So this is how we can understand the limitation of assessment as of learning. Assessment as of learning is basically a very narrowly conceived view of education. It's a very limited view of education. It has very limited learning outcomes that is focusing on only, according to Bloom's, remembering and understanding. That's why lower order thinking skills can be developed using this sort of assessment. If your schools, if you will think, if you will reflect, go back to your school life, and you see how that was how the practices of your schools were in past. So what kind of assessment approaches your teachers were using at that time, then you will come to know what kind of education you got from your schools. So this is how you can understand, this is how you can develop the meaning of school improvement. School improvement is not something very limited to improve some facilities, very, to come up with some typical resources to aid in the school. Rather, it is very comprehensive way of looking at each and every engagement of teachers, principal, and everyone who is attached with the school life, school and schooling. Um, so that needs to be understood very clearly. Otherwise, you will not understand the philosophy of school improvement. So when you look at these things and you start reflecting in your school life and try to understand. So what kind of knowledge you got there? What kind of knowledge your teachers were interested to test you? Either you have acquired certain level of knowledge. What was that? Is that knowledge was at only remembering and understanding level? Is that knowledge was more than remembering and understanding level? I mean that was at applying knowledge and analyzing knowledge, or is that knowledge was linked with a kind of more interestingly evaluating something and creating new knowledge. So you can better understand your past, you can better understand how the teachers were exposed to particular philosophies, exposed to particular approaches to teaching and understanding curriculum, and then coming to particular approaches to assessment in their schools in order to facilitate their learners. So this is how you can develop your clear understanding of the school improvement. School improvement comes with each and every activity that is related with the curriculum, that is related with teaching, that is related with assessment, and that is related with whole culture and the environment of the school and out of the school, at home and everywhere. So this is how you can understand the philosophy of assessment is of learning. So philosophy of assessment is of learning is, I just will wind up this activity, conclude this activity, this particular concept of assessment as of learning in the form of, very briefly, it is a very limited concept of assessment. This assessment is focusing only on a summative kind of assessment. And a summative assessment means an assessment that is happen after a semester, after an academic year, after a particular class. The purpose of this assessment is to just check whether students have learned something limited, whatever the teacher has given to them in a very limited way of remembering and understanding level. So either the teachers, students have come up with the ideas which the teacher has shared in the classroom or not. So based on this, the teachers at the end of the semester, they give two things: either they are promoted to the next grade or they are failed. So to label fail and pass, so this purpose of assessment is focusing. And when you look at your school life and the other practices in schools, and you can see mostly teachers in our context of Gilgit-Baltistan, particularly in Pakistan in general, and developing countries as well. So the focus has been on promotion. The focus has been on looking at either student has passed their exams or not, they are able to promote to the next grade level or not. So this, with this limited purpose, this assessment is of learning, this summative assessment is widely practiced in every school. So this is how you can understand the limitation of this particular assessment approach. And I guess